Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to today's distinguished session at Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. We are honored to be joined by one of the world's foremost authors on modern French history, Professor Julian Jackson, a prominent British historian and professor of history at Queen Mary University of London. Professor Jackson is renowned for his deep expertise in 20th century France, especially the eras of World War II, the Popular Front, and the Vichy regime. His acclaimed biography, De Gaulle, A Certain Idea of France, offers a portrait of Charles de Gaulle, the soldier, statesman, and enduring symbol of France's resilience. This extraordinary work, which earned the prestigious Duff Cooper Prize, has been made accessible to Arabic readers through the Abu Dhabi Arabic Language Center Translation Project Kalima, allowing us to explore de Gaulle's vision and legacy through a rich and resonant lens. It's a true privilege to welcome to the stage a fellow of the British Academy, a member of Royal Historical Society, and a historian whose work continues to inspire and inform. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Julian Jackson.
Thank you. I think I will go here because I can see the PowerPoint. Yeah, so. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? You can all hear, good. And thank you for the introduction, thank you for the invitation. It was a wonderful honor that my book was translated into Arabic. It's been translated into about 10 languages, but this is the first of my books that ever been translated into Arabic, so it's a great honor. I could have tried to talk today about the de Gaulle and the Arab world, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk more generally, because the title I was given was, by the organizers, was The Legacy of de Gaulle. So I want to kind of talk about that. But let's begin by looking, I'm currently doing a new book about cartoons of de Gaulle in the international cartoons of de Gaulle. And during his lifetime, one must remember that even if today we see de Gaulle as this extraordinary figure, he was often mocked and laughed at internationally. Here's a typical example, de Gaulle sitting in front of the globe. He thinks the globe is France, and he paints out other countries. Here is another de Gaulle. This is de Gaulle like Louis XIV, and there's President Kennedy, and de Gaulle is in a little Citroen, and Kennedy is a Cadillac. And this is mocking a bit de Gaulle's pretension to be a world leader against the Americans. Here we have many times, so we just go back, so that's Kennedy. Kennedy, that's the symbol of the Free French, and that's de Gaulle as Louis XIV. Next one, you get many, many cartoons that portray de Gaulle as Don Quixote, Don Quixote. You know, the Spanish man who's a bit of a fantasist and who goes and he tilts at windmills pointlessly. And there you see, same idea, there is de Gaulle on a horse tilting against the dollar. Lot of things like that. Lots of things that mock his nose. So here you have de Gaulle, the mountain, the nose mountain, and that's the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, who is trying to join the economic community, the Europe, and de Gaulle is making it very, very difficult for him because de Gaulle did not want the British in the European community. And then finally, you also get comparisons between de Gaulle and historical figures. This is de Gaulle in the 1940s, a British cartoonist who imagines de Gaulle as Hitler with also Napoleon in the background. So you get these many, many, a lot of mockery of de Gaulle at the time. And I think no one would have predicted how extraordinary his reputation now is today. This was an opinion poll in France in 2010. and the French were basically asked, who is the greatest figure in French history? And 70%, 40% give de Gaulle first, and 70% at least name de Gaulle. Long way down. 14% first give Napoleon, and others also mention Napoleon. So for the French people, this is 2010, de Gaulle is the hero of their history, long way before anybody else. And when they are asked, what do you remember de Gaulle for? What's the biggest thing about de Gaulle? Most of them, it's the resistance. It's the famous speech he made on the BBC on the 18th of June 1940. Then they remember the man of the liberation, then they remember the founder of the Republic, and at the end, only 4% remember the de Gaulle of decolonization. When President Macron became president in 2012, all presidents have an official photograph. And President Macron had himself photographed there, and behind him there's a book. And what is the book? The book is the Mémoires de Guerre, the war memoirs of de Gaulle. And I tried to magnify this to see what page it was open at, but you can't see, unfortunately. But it shows Macron says, de Gaulle is the person I want to refer to. This is another example. It's not a very good photograph. This is the Cross of Lorraine, the great Gaullist cross at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, which was de Gaulle's, where de Gaulle is buried. And that's the famous cross. Now, what's important here is the people lined up in front of the cross here are members of the right-wing party, the Rassemblement National. In the middle, Marine Le Pen. Why is that interesting? Because her father was violently anti-Gaullist. So even the anti-Gaullists are now Gaullist. This is an article in The Guardian, British newspaper, last week, where a British journalist, Timothy Garton-Ash, who actually quotes my book in his article, says, we need today Churchillo-Gaullism, or de Gaulle-Churchill. So he refers. And finally, this is the Vice President of the United States today, J.D. Vance. And Vance has given many interviews in which he says, although Vance made a very anti-European speech in Munich a few weeks ago, he says that the man one man he admires is de Gaulle for his vision, and he also cited my book. So de Gaulle is now back. So there may have been mockery, but now de Gaulle seems to be, everybody wants to talk about de Gaulle for different kinds of reasons. What's quite interesting about that is de Gaulle himself, and I talk about this in my book a lot, was often very pessimistic, like Churchill. De Gaulle was like this. He would sometimes be very optimistic, but then he would become very pessimistic, and sometimes he looked round, and this is a quotation in 1967, when he looks round and he says, after I'm gone, everything will be forgotten. I will be forgotten. It's like a theater. I go and nothing happens. So he himself didn't completely predict the extent to which he is now seen as a kind of reference point. So I want to talk about two areas where we talk a lot today about the legacy of de Gaulle, about de Gaulle today. And one is the founding of the Fifth Republic, which is the political regime France has today. And the second is de Gaulle's vision of international relations, which is where somebody like J.D. Vance or Garton-Ash, when Garton-Ash wrote that article a month ago, he was saying, in the current crisis in the world, de Gaulle has lessons for us. But before that, because my book about de Gaulle is not about the legacy, it's very much about the man and his life and what kind of politician he was and what kind of leader he was. And before going on to these questions of legacy and the relevance of de Gaulle today, I want to just highlight three things about de Gaulle that seem to me to be very interesting and important about the kind of political leader that he was. And then we'll come to my 2 points. So first, the first thing I want to say, so I want to make 3 points about the kind of leader that de Gaulle was. And the first is that he was an intellectual. He was a politician, he was a soldier, but he was also a thinker in a way that very few politicians are. Most politicians are not thinkers. De Gaulle was very influenced by a philosopher, an important French philosopher of the turn of the century called Henri Bergson. And Bergson wrote a lot about what he called about the difference between instinct and intelligence, between reason and sentiment. And de Gaulle, all his life, said, and this is a quotation, but there are many similar ones, that Bergson was the philosopher, the thinker that had most influenced him. And what he meant by that was that if you are to be, because de Gaulle for me is very unusual. He's different from Churchill. Churchill was an instinctive leader, but de Gaulle was a cerebral thinking leader. And he reflected very carefully about what makes a leader before he became one. And for him, a great leader needs to have 2 things. Instinct, a kind of courage, action, but also reflection. And here he says, instinct is important. Intellect and impulse, I use the word instinct, but intellect and impulse go together. Great men have both intellect and impulse. Without impulse, without instinct, reflection is useless. But without reflection, instinct is useless. And he thought very deeply about those 2 concepts. And let me give you, to me, an example where those 2 concepts are concretely embodied by de Gaulle. Let's take the most famous thing that de Gaulle ever did. The decision he made on the 17th of June, 1940, to leave France. France had been defeated, but de Gaulle said the defeat is not definitive. We've lost the battle, but we've not lost the war. So de Gaulle said, I'm going to go to London and continue French resistance from London. Now that is an extraordinary act of instinct. It's also an act of extraordinary moral courage. Imagine you're a soldier. Soldiers are trained to obey. All his life, de Gaulle had been a soldier in the army. He'd been trained to obey, and now he breaks with the army. He breaks with every institution in France, with nobody else, and he goes to London. Now that is pure instinct. It's saying, I've got to act. But it was instinct which was informed by reflection. Because if you read the famous speech that he made on the BBC on the 18th of June, 1940, he said the flame of resistance must burn, right? So he said we must, but he gave reasons. He said this is going to be a world war. France has an empire. Britain has an empire. America, which is not yet in the war, has huge economic and industrial might. This war can be won. So it's an act of instinct with reason. So my first point about the kind of leader de Gaulle is it's the combination of those two ideas. Second, and this is, just an example, this is one of the most wonderful speeches de Gaulle ever gave in London in 1942. And he's got those two ideas there. He said, he quotes a French philosopher who says, the reasonable have survived and the passionate have lived. And he says, we have lived a lot because we are passionate, but we have survived as well because we are reasonable. So for de Gaulle, these two ideas are fundamental to his way of thinking about politics. The second point, so I said there were going to be 3 points about the kind of political leader de Gaulle was. Secondly, de Gaulle believed all his life, and he wrote about this already in 1924, his first book. And he believed that great leaders must be adaptable to circumstances. There's no point in having an idea about the world, if you can't adapt that idea of the world according to circumstances. And in a book already in 1924, he said, in every form of action, the essential role of the leader is to appreciate the nature of the circumstance in each case. And he was obsessed with this idea of the importance of circumstances and the intelligence of the leader. Now, where do we see that in action? Algeria. When de Gaulle comes back to power in 1958, France is in a civil war in Algeria. There's an uprising against France. It's been going on since 1954. De Gaulle comes back, and nobody, including de Gaulle, I think, quite knows what he wants to do about Algeria. Does he want Algeria to be independent? Does he want to keep Algeria? Does he want an association? I don't think he knows himself. He's open to, but gradually he sees the inevitability that circumstances of Algerian independence. And again, unlike many people on the right who wanted to hold on to Algeria at all costs forever, de Gaulle said, no, you've got to take account of reality. And this is a speech he made towards the end of the Algerian War. Algeria became independent in 1962. And de Gaulle made this wonderful speech on the radio, on television, where he said, it's natural to feel nostalgia for the empire. One can regret the gentle light of oil lamps, the splendor of sailing ships, but there is no value in a policy that does not take account of realities. So de Gaulle is the ultimate realist, not opportunist, but realist, pragmatist, realizing that a great leader must adapt according to circumstances. So that's my second idea that I talk about a lot in the book. Thirdly, and this one is perhaps a bit surprising, because the idea that many people have about de Gaulle is that he was this very authoritarian, very impossible to disagree with. If de Gaulle said something, everybody said yes. On the contrary, one of the very interesting things about de Gaulle is the extent to which he was always ready to listen to advice. And that's the thing that most surprised me in the book, his capacity to listen and adapt. And I'll give one particular example of this. During the Algerian War, he sent a one of his advisors to Algeria in 1958, a young man, an economist called Paul de Louvrier, and he said to de Louvrier, can you go to Algeria, go around the country and then give me your view about what we should do. And de Louvrier is a young man, he's 35 years old. He comes back, he goes to the Élysée Palace, he sees de Gaulle, and de Gaulle is very intimidating. He's very big, but he's also very famous. And de Louvrier comes in and de Gaulle says, thank you for going to Algeria. He sits down, he says, tell me what you think. And de Louvrier speaks for 40 minutes, giving all his points, and de Gaulle looks as though he's asleep. And when de Gaulle looks as though he's asleep, he's very dangerous, because he's not asleep, really. He just looks as though he's asleep. And he's listening, but he takes no notes. And then at the end, when he's finished, de Gaulle says, thank you. And de Louvrier says, didn't he listen to a word? And then de Gaulle says, I will now summarize what you have said, the 6 points you have made, and I will give my comments on each of the 6 points. And de Gaulle then spoke for 40 minutes, having listened, assimilated, thought about it, and replied. And de Louvrier said, I've never had an experience like it. Someone who had this capacity to listen, to integrate, to synthesize, to think, and then to answer. And for me, that was a big surprise, because the image that many people have of de Gaulle is this man who wants courtiers. And de Gaulle never wanted courtiers. He wanted people to stand up to him, but they had to be tough, they had to be intelligent, but he was ready. And for me, very few political leaders are like that. Most political leaders in democracies and in dictatorships and in monarchies want agreement. De Gaulle didn't want disagreement, but he wanted serious argument. And actually, curiously, one other person who was a bit like that was Thatcher in England. She has the reputation of being very abrasive, but she also liked arguing. But I don't think she really listened, whereas I think de Gaulle had a capacity d'écoute, to listen, which was remarkable. So those are 3 ideas that my book talks about quite a lot, and there are many other things. But now I want to go back to where we begun. If you remember, I showed you all those cartoons mocking de Gaulle, and I now want to say, what is his legacy? Is there a legacy? And I think there are 2 areas where we can say there is a legacy. And the first is the Fifth Republic. The regime that France has today is the regime that de Gaulle set up in 1958 when he came back to power, the Fifth Republic. That's the first thing. And then the second is de Gaulle left us, one of the legacies of de Gaulle is a particular vision of international relations. And I want to talk about those. Now, interestingly, today, de Gaulle's Fifth Republic is quite criticized in France, whereas his ideas about Europe and the world have much more come back into fashion. And let's just look at that now. First, the Fifth Republic. So, when de Gaulle came back to power in 1958, for those who know nothing about French history, France was a parliamentary democracy with a tradition of very, very weak executive power. So the president basically had no more than ceremonial power. And since 1945, de Gaulle had argued that most of the problems of France in the 40s came from the weakness of the government. So he comes back to power in 1958 with an idea to create a new kind of presidential constitution. and that is the Fifth Republic. Now, it's a very complicated story because it's not a presidential regime. America is a presidential regime. France is not. Because the president in America has, there is a complete separation of powers in America between the president and the parliament. Donald Trump could not dissolve Congress. He has no right to do that. Congress is elected when it's elected. The president cannot dissolve the parliament. There's a separation of powers. France is a hybrid. The president can dissolve parliament, and he appoints, and the president does not head the government. There is a prime minister who heads the government, and the prime minister is responsible to parliament. President Trump is responsible to no one because he is president of a non-parliamentary system. So de Gaulle created a very strange constitution, a bit of parliamentarianism and a bit of presidency. But the biggest innovation came in 1962, when de Gaulle introduced what is now a key feature of French politics, that the president would be elected by the people, universal suffrage. Now you might say, well, that's good, it's normal, it's democratic. But in fact, it was very controversial. It was opposed by all politicians, from the left, the communists, all the way to the right. And why? Because they said this is a kind of French fascism. And why did they say that? Because they remembered Napoleon. They remembered Bonapartism. And in the French memory, a president elected by universal suffrage could become a Bonapartist dictator. But de Gaulle said, I don't care, we're going to do it. He had a referendum, he consulted the French people, he said, are you happy? They said yes, a huge majority. And so ever since 1962, the president of France has been elected by universal suffrage. Now, even those who opposed it at the time, the best example, François Mitterrand. François Mitterrand, socialist president elected in 1981. In 1964, Mitterrand wrote a book denouncing the Fifth Republic, saying that it was a permanent coup d'etat. It was a dictatorship. But then Mitterrand got himself elected in that system, and so the system, which was a good thing for the system, because it showed that it could, as it were, have a president of the left and a president of the right. So since then, France has got this unusual system, but that seems to work. It's been there since 1958, and it seems to me that it has worked very well. It has given a stability that was not there before. But over the last few years, there has been increasing criticism of the excessive authoritarianism that gives the possibility of. That a President Macron very much wanted to reassert what he saw as Gaullist ideas of a stronger president. And many people objected, and they said that this Jupiter style was a problem, and that France's problems were from too strong a president. And then last year, President Macron took a very controversial decision to dissolve the National Assembly in order to get a better parliament, and it didn't work, and we have a paralyzed parliament. So more and more people are saying the French system doesn't work. I don't agree. I think all systems are imperfect. The French system is no more imperfect than the American system, which is not exactly a model today, or the British system. And it seems to me that what de Gaulle did, and what de Gaulle has left to France, is something unique to France, this hybrid system. And what I'm very struck by is the one thing the French people are really passionate about is the presidential election. So for all the people say, we don't like the Fifth Republic, when it comes to the election, they like it. Because there is a direct relationship between the people and the person they elect. And I think de Gaulle's intuition there was correct. And yes, there are problems, but it worked. And it worked better than the Fourth Republic. I could talk more about that if you want. Last point, let's look at de Gaulle's legacy on Europe. Now this is on slightly more complicated. Now, when de Gaulle came back to power in 1958, he sent a letter to President Eisenhower, which was also copied to the British Prime Minister Macmillan. And basically, that's the beginning of the letter. And what he was proposing was that France would play an equal role to Britain and the United States in the governance of NATO. He said, NATO has been dominated by the British and the Americans, set up in 1949. We want France to have an equal role in NATO, what he called a tripartite governance of NATO. So he sent this letter to Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, and to Eisenhower, the American President. At the same time, or a little bit later, he sent a letter to the German Chancellor, Adenauer, saying, we need to bring an end to that American integration in which the Atlantic Alliance, which contradicts the idea of an independent Europe. The Atlantic Alliance must be founded on new bases. So he comes to power saying, we need to reform NATO. France needs a bigger role, and Europe needs a bigger role. So that's the beginning point. Now, many people took the view that de Gaulle's view of international politics was, going back to some of those slides I showed you, old-fashioned. So the criticisms of this position are the following. One, de Gaulle had outmoded ideas of grandeur, of French grandeur. He was a nostalgic. He thought he was Louis XIV. He thought, that's one argument. I don't think that's correct, because although de Gaulle used the word grandeur, grandeur, glory a lot, he didn't mean that France was going to become the greatest power in Europe again. He knew that was not possible. For him, the word grandeur simply meant showing that you counted, being seen, being visible, having a voice. So I don't think it was a kind of folie de grandeur, like Don Quixote. I think it was a rational idea that to be respected, you have to be heard. A second idea is that de Gaulle was anti-American. Now, I don't think he was anti-American. In fact, I think he was fascinated by America. And one reason people think of de Gaulle as an anti-American is they say he was influenced by his memory of the Second World War. That's a famous meeting in Morocco in 1943 between Churchill, de Gaulle, Roosevelt, and General Giraud. Now, General Giraud was Roosevelt's candidate to be, as it were, the leader of, to put it simply, the leader of France. In other words, Roosevelt had a real dislike of de Gaulle. He was suspicious of de Gaulle because he thought de Gaulle was a sort of proto-nationalist. He had many reasons to dislike de Gaulle. So some people say, so de Gaulle's anti-Americanism comes from his memory of the war. No, I think what the war taught de Gaulle was America it taught him the importance of America. It taught him the danger of not being able to assert your independence. He was fascinated by America, but not critical, but not anti-American. So he said, America's very different. It's got a very different history from ours. It's never been invaded. It's not suffered like the Europeans have suffered in 2 world wars. This wasn't a criticism, it was an observation that America saw the world differently from Europe. And he was also fascinated by American power. The first time he went to America in 1944, he said, God, it's extraordinary, this sheer economic power. And he was excited by it, but he also said, they're a danger because they have this power, and any nation that has power wants to use it. So we need to think about our response to that. So what motivated de Gaulle's memorandum to Eisenhower, or his letter to Adenauer? What motivated it, I think? We need to go back to the way de Gaulle saw the world, saw international politics. De Gaulle basically believed that the essential core of people's existence was the nation state. We are where we were born. National attachment is the most important thing. So de Gaulle never believed in, for example, the eternity of communism. De Gaulle never talked about the Soviet Union. Never. He talked about Russia. Because he said, the Soviet Union will come and go, but Russia will always be there. Russia will absorb communism like blotting paper absorbs ink. What follows from that? That de Gaulle never believed that the division of the world into 2 blocks, the free world, if you want, the Atlantic Alliance, the West, and the communist bloc, was eternal. It's not eternal, because things change. And he once said, this is a quotation from 1962, you never know what's going to happen. The world will change. And we are wrong to think that America will always think it is in her interest to defend Europe. Because for de Gaulle, interest is what matters. Ideology, the free world against communism, that'll come and go. If the Americans think it's in their interest to defend Europe, they will defend Europe. If it is not in their interest, they won't. And that's not bad, that's normal, because all states think about their interests. But his point is, we also have to think about our interests. We have to think about a world in which, perhaps, one day, America will no longer want to defend us. And what do we do then? If we have not got some kind of strategic autonomy, we are vulnerable. So, at the same time as he sent his memorandum to Eisenhower, de Gaulle announced that although the British, the Americans, and the Soviet Union, the only 3 nuclear powers, the only 3 atomic powers, the only 3 countries that had the atom bomb, those 3 countries had declared a moratorium on nuclear testing, atomic testing. De Gaulle said, no, I won't. We don't have an independent nuclear deterrent, and we want one, and therefore the moratorium is a kind of club of the British, the Americans, and the Soviets to keep us, everybody out. So I will test, and I believe that it is necessary for France to have an independent nuclear deterrent. And that was the keystone of his defense policy based on, I repeat, the idea that you can never be sure that your allies will be your allies always. You have got to be ready for independence. That was the key message. Now, Eisenhower and then Kennedy said, look, you're wrong about this. Look, we supported you in the First War, and we supported you in the Second War. And de Gaulle said, oh yes, but in the First War, it took you 3 years before you arrived. And in the Second War, it took you, so you didn't arrive till 1917. We'd been fighting for 3 years. In 1940, you didn't arrive till December 1941. So he said, no, you came when it was in your interest to come, not out of some disinterested idealism. So we have to be prepared for that eventuality. And his other great fear, which again looks relatively prescient today, was his fear that Europe, and obviously I'm in Abu Dhabi, and Europe is a long way away, but for us in Europe, this is a big problem. His fear was that in Europe, what could happen if Europe did not have her own autonomy, her own capacity to defend herself, that the two great powers, the Soviet Union and America, could do a deal over Europe, pushing Europe out of the way. This was what we could call de Gaulle's Yalta complex. He was very resentful that France in 1944 had been excluded, 45 had been excluded from the Yalta Conference, when basically Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt decided the future of the world. And de Gaulle was haunted by this idea that in 1944 France did not exist because of the defeat. And never again, never will we have the danger that the two superpowers can talk over us. And again, if you look at the situation today, I don't need to underline the similarities, where Ukraine, which obviously is again very important for Europeans, the future of Ukraine is being decided at the moment not by Ukraine, not by Europe, but by the Americans and the Russians. So de Gaulle said, we need to think about European solution. Now the problem was, I think he diagnosed the problem, but unfortunately he didn't have the solution, or rather his solution didn't work. So the memorandum that I talked about to Eisenhower, where he says, we want to be an equal partner in NATO, the Americans didn't respond, the British didn't respond, so in 1966, de Gaulle left NATO. Now, most people think he always intended to leave NATO, that he never believed that the Americans would accept his proposal. And he had his alternative to the tripartite NATO was a European defense, hence the letter to Adenauer. And de Gaulle, who's often seen as an anti-European, was an anti-federalist, but very much had an idea that Europe needed to count as a union of nation states. And so his idea was that France would be the core of a European autonomous defense, if you want. That never worked. It failed totally. It failed because the Germans and other countries were as afraid of France as they were of, more afraid, they were a bit afraid of France, and, well, they were partly afraid of France, and partly they thought France doesn't really have the capacity to defend us if necessary. Adenauer could not give up the possibility of American defense for the vague possibility of a not very effective French defense. So it failed. And although de Gaulle signed a treaty, a very important treaty of friendship with Germany in 1963, which remains very important, it remains a very important thread, Franco-German relations. Nonetheless, his idea of what you might call a strategically autonomous European defense never came to anything. But now we're back there, because many of the things that de Gaulle said have been proven to be true. The question is, what do we do next? Or what does Europe do next? Can Europe do what it couldn't do when de Gaulle was there for all kinds of reasons? We don't know. And what's very interesting is that the European community, with the British also, have been talking about a massive increase in military expenditure, which de Gaulle would have approved of. But the problem is that Europe has 170 different weapon systems scattered around. America has about 30. So creating a European, you may have the money, but it's going to take very difficult decisions. For example, it might be strategically rational to close a factory in Toulouse or to close a factory in Hamburg, or to open a factory in Sweden. That's to say, some people are going to lose and some people are going to win. Is that going to happen? And finally, I would say in some ways, a decision made by de Gaulle before he came back to power has made the solution to the problem possibly more difficult than it might have been. Because in 1953, de Gaulle vetoed, he was not in power, but he wasn't the only person, but he strongly opposed the idea of setting up, it was very embryonic, a European defense community, an integrated European defense. Now, would it have worked or would it have not worked? We don't know. But essentially, that's what the Europeans are looking to do today. And you could say that had de Gaulle been more open to that idea in the 1950s, it might not be so difficult today. Who knows? So I would end by saying that de Gaulle, I think, was the most extraordinary. I gave 3 reasons why I think he was an amazing political leader. And I think he diagnosed brilliantly many of the problems that are facing Europe today. But unfortunately, he didn't find the solution, and I don't know whether anybody else is going to, because we don't have any leaders currently with all the qualities that I have outlined of de Gaulle. Thank you. Time for questions or not, but if there is there time? One question. Okay, there's one question.
Professor, I really enjoyed your talk about Charles de Gaulle, and I had one question. It was about the quote that you put in 1962.
Sorry, about the
quote that you put from 1962 Yep. About the instability of the international order. So my question was, does this quote, it reminded me of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. Is there like some sort of relationship between his ideology, which I took to be more pragmatic, and Samuel Huntington and his Clash of Civilizations?
I don't think so. I think de Gaulle wouldn't have liked a model that is so. The Huntington model is a very fixed model. He believes in a clash of civilizations. And I think de Gaulle would have always said that there is no model, that eternal model that explains the world. The world is always in flux. So he might at one time or other have thought, yes, that this could apply. But it's, to me, that way of looking at international politics was almost the opposite of the way he looked. I go back to that quote earlier, Bergson, you know, at the beginning. And Bergson's whole philosophy was about unpredictability, about fluidity. And although de Gaulle had some very fixed ideas, I mean, de Gaulle's ideas about the relationship between de Gaulle and Islam is quite an interesting subject, actually, because he had, when he came back to power, one of the things he most wanted to do was rebuild good relations with the Arab states, because relations with the Middle East had suffered because the French in the Fourth Republic had developed a very strong relationship with Israel, going back to the Suez crisis in 1956. And then the Algerian War happened. So the moment de Gaulle comes back to power, he's very strongly wanting to re-establish good relations with the Arab world. That's one of his big ideas. Hence, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, to the great surprise of a lot of people, de Gaulle takes a fairly anti-Israeli position. He claims that he says that a phrase he used a lot was the Israelis are exaggerating, they're pushing their luck too far, and so on. And he put an arms embargo on sending further arms to Israel, and so on. So but he also had one of his reasons for one of the arguments he put for the independence of Algeria was that those people who believed in Algeria integrated into France, which was the dream of the Algérie Française group, he said, well, what will you have? You will have in Algeria a huge Muslim population that will become full French citizens. And he made a famous, a slightly jocular, slightly jokey comment, but I think he was thinking of it. He said, if we have Algeria integrated into France, my village, Colombey, with the two churches, Colombey will become Colombey, the two mosques, become Colombey. So he was very complicated in his views of, well, the relationship between the West and the Middle East and Islam. But my own view is that he was always, that's why I go back to your question, he wouldn't have wanted a simple model, I think, because that to me was the opposite of the way he thought about the world. And we could just take one other example. What would de Gaulle think about the Middle East today, about the Gaza war? I have no idea. And there's a danger in trying to make de Gaulle speak from the grave. You could argue de Gaulle would take a very anti-Israeli position, but you could argue the opposite. We don't know. And for me, what's admirable about de Gaulle is certain principles of leadership and certain big principles about how the world works. But beyond that, we can't make him speak from the grave because he was never fixed. And so I don't know whether that's a good answer, but I don't think that fits his vision of the world. I think I've been told that I don't know what time it is, but yeah, I think we've finished. We started a bit late actually, but still, I think we are told to stop. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And I think if anybody wants to buy a copy of the book, I'm happy to sign it outside in Arabic. Thank you.